Let's go back into our pre-comp and see if we can make this animation a little bit more exciting. I'll collapse these two layers and go back to our frame layer and press S to bring up the scale. Then I'll go into the graph editor and select the scale property, and this time I want to switch to my value graph. If I select my keyframes and reset them back to easy ease, I'm going to solo this layer so I can just focus on it. Right now the animation is going from the center outwards on the x-axis, but it's still just going from point A to point B. I want to add a little bit more character to this animation. To do that, I'm going to back up to right about here and set another keyframe by clicking on the Add Keyframe button. Then I'll click and drag on this keyframe until it goes above the value of the last keyframe. Now our layer is going to animate from 0 to being wider than 100% and then scale back down to 100. If I click and drag on this new handle, you see that it's not affecting this handle as well. To fix that, I'll hold Option or Alt on a PC and hover over the keyframe so you can see that my tool is now changed. If I click, that will get rid of my handles, and then if I click one more time, it brings the handles back. Now those two handles are linked together. Because they're linked, our curve will be nice and smooth. If I were to hold down Option and click on that handle again, I could move it independently. But then our value curve comes to this point at a certain angle and then completely changes directions, and it would result in a very jagged animation. I'll go ahead and play this back so you can see what I mean. You see how it kind of bounces there at the end? It's almost like it's hitting a wall. It's not what I'm looking for. If I hold Option again or Alt on a PC, click on that keyframe and then click one more time, now I have a nice smooth curve. I'll click on this handle and hold the Shift key, and that will snap the handles to being straight across. I'll modify my handles just a little bit while holding the Shift key so that the value gets to that point pretty quickly and then eases out into its final destination. Let's preview that. And now you see that our animation is kind of doing a little bit of a bouncy animation, and that's what I'm going for. This type of curve going past its final value before coming to a resting point is called overshoot. It's a very common technique in animation and can add a lot of personality. I'm going to exaggerate this a little bit more by clicking and dragging on this keyframe upwards so it goes even further outwards. And we'll play that back. Now you can see that the width goes even further out before coming to its final point. And if I click and drag that keyframe backwards in time, I can speed up that initial animation. And if I wanted to, I could add another keyframe here by switching to the pen tool, by clicking on the tool up here or pressing G on the keyboard, adding another keyframe, switching back to my selection tool by pressing V on the keyboard or clicking right up here, then click and drag this keyframe down below the final value, shift clicking to make this curve horizontal, adjusting my value graph a little bit, and then play it back. And now we've got an extra bounce. I'm going to go ahead and select these two keyframes and then move them backwards a little bit in time so they happen a little bit quicker. And this kind of gives the layer just some elasticity, so you can kind of give your objects a distinct feel visually using this technique. I like the way that that looks, so I'll unsolo this layer and then preview the animation again. Now if I switch back out of my graph editor, I can move these second two layers back in time to right about here so the whole thing happens quicker. Let's do that overshoot animation again, but this time from the center of this layer. So I'll solo this layer, go into the scale of that layer, reset the anchor point to the center of the layer by holding Option, Command, Home, or Alt, Control, Home on a PC, preview that animation, and see that now it's coming from the center. But I'm actually going to switch my first keyframe back to being 0 by 0, so it scales completely from the center of the frame. It's not happening exactly the way that I wanted it to, because the easing for one axis is not the same as the easing for the other axis. So to fix that, I'll select both keyframes, ease them by pressing F9 on the keyboard, and now they're animating at the same pace. Let's do the same trick again by going about this point, adding another keyframe by pressing G to bring up my pen tool, click, switch back to the selection tool by pressing V, click and drag upwards, and you'll notice that I couldn't move both of those anchor points at the same time. This is where things can get a little tricky with the value graph. If I try to move this upwards and set that value, and then I try to move my second axis to that same point, unfortunately, they don't snap together. It'll snap to a different keyframe, but not to the same keyframe's other axis. So the way that I can make sure that this axis value is set to the same axis value as this one, I could simply come over here to the scale property, click on the value I want applied to both, copy by pressing Command-C or Control-C on a PC, then clicking on the second value and pasting. Now both of the value points are on the same spot. Then I'll just adjust these handles to match as closely as possible and play that back. So we've got a nice little overshoot. I'm going to bring this keyframe backwards a little bit and then add another keyframe right about here. Click and drag till it's down below the last value. Ease the keyframes by pressing F9 on the keyboard, and then click and drag on these handles to adjust my value graph. And just finesse this a little bit so that I can see visually that the curve is going to represent the type of motion that I want. And then play that back. And that's a little bit extreme, so I'm just going to finesse this a little bit. Preview that. And just adjust a little bit more. And this is really how I approach every animation. You just got to play with it until it looks the way that you want it to. Here I'm running into an issue where I can't place my point where I want to because I have snapping turned on. So if I disable that, I can then place this exactly where I want it and then turn snapping back on. And then I think I just want to move these two keyframes in a little bit, so I'll select the two keyframes, hold Option or Alt on a PC and press the left arrow a couple times, and then do the same thing for the last keyframe, preview that. I'm pretty happy with that. So I'll unsolo this layer so we can see what it looks like all together. That's looking pretty good. Now, what if we were to change the anchor point of this layer to be, say, in the top left corner? Well, now our overshoot happens in this diagonal direction. So again, just play around with your graph editor in combination with the anchor point and just try experimenting with some things to see what you can come up with. I'm going to move that anchor point to the top and see what that looks like. I kind of like that, so I'm actually going to copy and paste these keyframes to the other layer so I can have the same type of animation. Get rid of that last keyframe, and then my anchor point is already set where I want it, so I'll preview that, and now I've got a completely different looking animation than what I had the first time. So let's go back to our main comp and see how that looks. So very quickly I was able to change the look of the entire animation so far. This is the basis for what we're going to do for the rest of the house. We'll animate the lower windows in the same way. There's just an added element of this top triangle. The door is probably the most complicated just because it has a few extra elements. Then there's the lamp, the bushes, and then the main components of the house. You can add as much or as little detail as you want. It's completely up to you.